I'm going to talk a little bit about the hierarchy of evidence. So take a step back from the grade systems. The grade system talks and uses various levels of evidence in making this decision. So what exactly is the hierarchy of evidence? Well, the goal here is to learn this hierarchy of therapy. How many of you in the audience actually know the hierarchy of evidence for a therapeutic intervention? The levels of evidence, by show of hands. So a few of you seem to know it. Okay. So again, going back to the evidence cycle, we talked about sort of the cycle itself. And when we're talking about sort of the gamut, all the way from the idea, so there's a lot. So this sort of pyramid really depicts really the challenges of taking an idea, and that idea ultimately getting into the lab, developing important biological hypotheses that may get put into a case report, make it into a case series, ultimately make it tested in a trial, and then make that big leap from a published large clinical trial to clinical practice. You can see that there's often lots and lots of challenges, and you get many more ideas that ultimately end up with very few large clinical trials ultimately that lead to changes in clinical practice. When we don't have a clinical trial, then we have to look at everything behind that, all the way down to the experimental rationale. But when we focus on clinical data, when there actually is clinical data out there, this is the hierarchy that we're talking about. And I'm going to focus this hierarchy for a therapeutic intervention. So for most surgical interventions, we're focusing on a therapeutic, a therapy of some sort, whether it's, surgery versus non-operative treatment or treatment A versus treatment B, or some novel, device put in versus a control, etc. With that being said, it goes from opinion at the base of this pyramid all the way up to the randomized trial and meta-analysis. The meta-analysis is up there because a meta-analysis of high-quality trials is in fact level 1 evidence. So it's can be the most powerful evidence if it's high-quality trials that are what we call very homogeneous and very consistent in their findings. So you'll often see that. And just to look at the impact of these meta-analyses, you'll see the Lancet, for example, and many other journals, top medical journals publish meta-analysis on relatively frequently. BMJ publishes them all the time. And why would they do that? They do that when they believe there's a high number of randomized trials of high quality, but pooling them actually provides you, as Brad said, even a more precise estimate of that treatment effect. So it narrows that confidence interval and helps you. So the whole issue, for example, with the COX-2 inhibitors and uncovering the fact that COX-2 inhibitors may in fact be more harmful than good in arthritis was based on the findings of a meta-analysis or a cumulative meta-analysis. But as we look at this, here in basic are the levels that we're talking about, levels 1 through level 5. So level 1 evidence, when people use that terminology, denotes a randomized trial. Level 2 evidence, as you can see here, denotes a prospective cohort study. Level 3 denotes a case control study. 4 retrospective case series, or case series in general, and level 5 opinions, such as that's sought out in let's say a survey of surgeons, for example. And a meta-analysis at any of these levels, becomes that level. So in other words, the meta-analysis of case series is ultimately going to be a level 4 procedure, or a level 4 grading, whereas a meta-analysis of high-quality randomized trials in and of itself can be called a level 1 evidence study. What do we do? And again, you're going to get lots of this tomorrow, but what is it that's so unique about randomization that makes that level 1 evidence? So when we talk about patients come in and through some form are randomized to 2 types of treatments for this example and followed forward in time to the outcome. So there's some critical things that the level of evidence tells us. In this particular case, this concept of randomization and the fact that we're moving forward in time puts randomized trials atop that hierarchy. So it's that random allocation of patients into 2 groups, and we'll get lots and lots about this tomorrow, but the power of randomization is really that balance of prognosis that you're gaining. So that's what puts randomization and randomized trials atop the hierarchy, and why it's such a powerful design in medicine for drug trials, but even equally as powerful for surgical trials. And certainly we're seeing more and more randomized trials in surgery being conducted. So we should randomize everybody, right? It's level 1. We should always be randomizing everybody, and we shouldn't really be thinking of any other design at all. There's got to be reasons why we wouldn't randomize. So folks, why wouldn't we do a randomized trial? Or sometimes why can't we do a randomized trial? What are some of the challenges in surgery? Think surgery. Problems are very rare, right? The outcomes are way too rare, and good luck recruiting 10,000 patients, right? It's unethical, right? You can come with a million examples, but let's use hip fracture. Hip fracture, is telling someone that will operate early versus will wait a week, or any fracture, or any injury, someone coming in with an acute abdominal syndrome of any sort and telling that, you've been randomized to wait a week. You can't do it, right? So it's just not possible. So, good. Bad ethics, outcomes are really rare. What else? Sorry? Right. So it's very difficult to blind the surgeon, right? So that's definitely another challenge. Anything else? Yeah. Great point. So what's equipoise, since you brought it up? Mm-hmm. Right. So that's a great. So the word equipoise, it really is this concept of, it's one of the sort of ethics of doing clinical trials is there has to be true uncertainty. There has to be true uncertainty about what treatment is better. The challenge is that, as a surgical group, very few surgeons walk into a room saying, I have no idea what I'm going to do. Well, maybe a few of us, maybe a few staff people you've worked with, but the reality is, it's not always the case, right? We're actually quite certain, right? Or there's some bias because you have to operate, right? So no one walks into a room saying, well, I can do a nail or a plate today. I can do it. There has to be a biological equipoise, and the equipoise can be at the individual level and it can be at the community level. So we don't always agree, but as a community, if there's enough general uncertainty, that's a good reason to move forward. But that's a good point. So a lack of equipoise. Anything else? How expensive is it to do these kind of trials? Anyone want to take a gander at that one? Very expensive to do some of these trials, right? A randomized trial costs, how much do you think? Let's say a randomized trial of 200 patients looking at two drugs. Let's say it's a phase 2 relatively exploratory study, hypothesis generating. How much do you think pharmaceutical company or drug company or even an orthopedic or an implant company might pay for that? Numbers? Anyone want to throw a number out? You're looking at $10, $15 million roughly, right, for all these drug trials. Your phase 2 trials are in that ballpark. And you get into phase 3 trials, you're looking at very expensive trials. And so, you can spend $400 million on bringing a product to market very easily. So they're expensive, right? And so when your surgical local division says that you've been awarded the $500 research prize, it's not going to get you too far, right? It might get you your parking paid in a hotel room. That's about it. So you got to keep that in context. But there are ethical issues, right? One is it ethical to randomize patients? Are the outcomes too rare? So we'll never be able to recruit so many patients. This is a big one. If you ever tried to do research, and for those of you who have attempted it, getting buy-in is critically important. It's very, again, surgical trials have that unique challenge, and that we have to get buy-in because there's going to be individuals who are absolutely, for the most part, saying, here's what I normally do for this problem, but you're asking me to randomize someone to what I normally do to something I don't normally do, and I may not have equal expertise or experience in that, and that in and of itself creates a bias. Or I might have strong preferences or beliefs that what I do is best, and I don't really want to risk patients getting something else. So you get these sort of challenges in these clinical trials. The primary question may not be one that requires a randomized trial. If we're looking at prognosis, for example, you don't need a randomized trial to identify sort of what factors may be associated with outcomes in certain problems. And cost, you'll never get enough money to pull it off. So there are reasons why randomized trials aren't done in surgery, and so there are lots of good reasons why you can consider other alternative approaches. But the bottom line is that we should at least be considering the randomized trial in surgery when there's an opportunity to do one, and think about that as an option. If we can't do a randomized trial, we can certainly look down that hierarchy to a level 2 evidence model, which is prospective cohort studies. So what's unique about the cohort? So I'm going to draw the picture out, and if you look at this, it looks pretty close or almost identical to the diagram you just saw for randomization, for the randomized trial, with one key important caveat. It moves forward in time, but the one thing we miss here is that patients are allocated to treatment A or treatment B by a non-random process. That's the key. So randomization is so powerful that it puts it atop the hierarchy. The minute we switched groups through some other process, whether it's surgeon's preference or whether it's patient's preference or some other mechanism beside a random process, it gets grouped as a cohort study, a prospective cohort study in this case, which downgrades it to a level 2. That's why level 1 is slightly more powerful than a level 2 study in terms of looking at evidence as a whole. What about level 3? Case control studies. So this is unique in that what we typically start with a traditional case control study is we start with the end in mind. So we start with infection or no infection. Think of any problem where infection, a surgical site infection, for example. And what you do is say, okay, let's look at our population of patients who've got an infection. Let's match them with those similar patients who didn't get an infection, and let's look backward in time to see what sort of things might be different between these two groups. Was this group just a group of had more diabetics, for example, or more immunocompromised patients that may have led them to that? And you can develop, in this case, odds ratios, as Brad talked about, and you can look at sort of the odds of getting an infection with various risk factors, so to speak. But the point here is here. You're not seeing randomization, right? So therefore, it's definitely not going to be a cohort. It's definitely not going to be a level 1 study. We're not seeing it prospective in time, so it's downgraded from a cohort to case control. So the point here, this is the first trial that's now a retrospective study design. That's why it's designated level 3, the case control design. And in the case, and I'm not going to spend time on the case series. I think there's not a single person here who doesn't know about a case series, but they're retrospectives, usually uncontrolled designs, and so they're designated level 4. So you typically lack a control group. But remember, the current best evidence implies that there's a hierarchy, right? So, and I've talked to you a little bit about Sackett, but he was an individual who has had a tremendous impact at McMaster, went to Oxford, and has subsequently come back and continues to teach at McMaster at the graduate level. And he was the one who actually coined the term. So, this term levels of evidence that has been adopted, I suspect, by most surgical journals, and certainly most surgical societies use the terminology of levels of evidence. Ultimately, it came from his original description of this terminology. As an example, the orthopedic community has certainly adopted it in its higher impact journal. But there's lots of other groups and other organizations, and I suspect the plastic surgeries have done it, and neurosurgery has done it, and general surgery has done it, etc. What we typically see in some of these journals is we see at the bottom now in some of these journals where at the bottom of the abstract it actually writes level of evidence, therapeutic study level 1. So as soon as you see that, we immediately think, okay, study about therapy, and we see it's level 1, so it's at least given the descriptor of being called a randomized trial. So if someone says level 1 evidence to you, it's a randomized trial. But in this problem, and as with throughout, the principle here is that randomized trials introduce less bias. And as you move down this hierarchy of evidence, there's more bias. That's basically the principle, and we're going to hear lots about bias limiting features tomorrow. When we talk about the hierarchy or these levels of evidence, the agreement's actually pretty good. So you can. We've done some research on it, but principally, I think if I were to give you a paper, I think we could all generally agree on what the level of evidence is. I think for the most part, it's reasonably good. But the point is, we don't really know how valid it is. We don't really know if a level 1 study really is that good, just based on a descriptor. And you'll find that out, and I'm sure you've had that situation where you've looked at something that comes across as an RCT up front. You read more details about that RCT, and you realize there's all kinds of other issues that would create problems for you. So in this particular case, the other challenge in surgery is, and this goes across all surgical disciplines, the majority of our literature is case series, right? So we aren't always dealing with randomized trials. So when we do see a randomized trial, it in many ways gets almost a disproportionately greater impact than any other design. And even the poor, not so good randomized trials get disproportionately higher impact than they should. And you don't see that in medicine, because in medicine, it takes pretty high quality data, pretty high quality trials to get into some of these journals. That being said, all study designs and all journals are fallible, and certainly the peer review process is certainly not one that has been perfected. But when we're talking about level 1, remember this. Just because it's level 1 does not mean they're all created equally. Just because someone says I have a randomized trial does not mean we immediately think of it as the best possible thing. We should adopt that. And as you heard from Grade, the Grade approach that Henry just talked about, it takes multiple randomized trials of high quality to really start convincing us that there's probably an effect going on. So what we're trying to do is, this level of evidence here tells us what's going on at the tip. What you're going to learn, if you haven't already done so, is you're going to learn how to figure all this stuff out, figure out what's going on below, and really dig deep quickly so you don't get caught up and bitten by these sorts of problems. So here's an example of a study that was done. A very good study, and it's published in a journal. It's a top journal, and it's written here as therapeutic level 2. So the journal actually published it as a level 2 study, but it's a randomized trial. So why did that happen? Did they get it wrong? 2 caveats. Remember this. 2 caveats is a poor quality study gets downgraded to level. So if it's a poor quality randomized trial, it gets downgraded to level 2. Or if they don't achieve, this is an arbitrary distinction, but in surgical trials, you need 80% follow-up. That apparently makes it better. So if you have 79, it's not so good. If you have 81, it seems to be great. That's just the way it seems to work out. But the point here is that less than 80% follow-up downgrades a level 1 study to a level 2 study. Somewhat arbitrary, but the point is that that's the distinction that's been made across these sorts of level of evidence grading. So you have to understand sort of the distinctions between them so you can interpret them appropriately. So that one likely had either less than 80% follow-up or maybe had some methodological issue that was deemed by the authors and the reviewers to downgrade it to a level 2. So to summarize, the case series is what level of evidence? Just yell it out. 4. Wonderful. Randomized trial? Randomized trial with methodological limitations. Case control? And a prospective cohort. Meta-analysis of RCTs, high quality. There you go. You guys are experts. So the hierarchy of evidence provides a guide towards organizing and categorizing clinical research, and studies that limit bias to the greatest extent are higher levels of evidence. That's what you want to take home from that.